This is Gene DeLisio with a featured sports interview from WDLB and WOSQ. One of the great figures of 20th century sports was Jackie Robinson, the man who broke baseball's color barrier and became the first African American to play Major League Baseball in over 60 years when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Robinson had a superb Major League career, playing for the Dodgers for 10 years and being voted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Robinson passed away in 1972, but his daughter Sharon keeps his memory alive by working with the Major League Baseball Mentorship Program and by writing children's books, many of which center around her father. Sharon Robinson visited central Wisconsin in early March at the invitation of Edgar Elementary School fifth grade teacher Colin Hansen. She spoke at several schools and also gave a public presentation on her father and her work at the Grand Theater in Wausau. And this was one of a number of presentations Robinson makes throughout the year.
Well, I primarily do school visits with my program I do with Major League Baseball and Scholastic, and that's all about overcoming obstacles and using values to get you past the crisis point and into thriving again. And I go to schools to celebrate winners of our national essay contest, and where they tell their own story of a barrier they've had to face and how they use the values to get to the next level. And we use my dad as a barrier breaker, both on and off the field, and then we use a lot of today's players who talk about either the values or barriers that they've had to face, and we do it in a curriculum that goes out to teachers, and also, or you can get online, so students go directly there as well. So that's a lot of my school visits now, but I also am a children's book author, so I visit schools as an author. Mm-hmm. So coming here, I'm sort of combining these two things as a children's book author and as talking with kids about the importance of my dad's character and being selected and being able to excel in baseball in spite of the pressure.
Mm-hmm. Your work with Major League Baseball, tell us about what that means to you to be able to spread your father's name and his legacy amongst young people today.
Well, it's been very important to me. I've been there 21 years, almost 22 years. And it came after a 20-plus year career as a nurse midwife, where I had just incredible experiences and taught for a number of years. But in 1997, it was the 50th anniversary of my dad breaking the color barrier, and I was engaged in baseball in a different kind of way, going out to clubs and throwing out first pitches and all. And I really felt like I'd like to come work with them and work nationally. So my child at that time had graduated from high school, so I had the freedom to travel. And baseball agreed, and I started this program. And it's the first time I've ever focused on my dad, both in my work and in my writing. And it's been instructive for me and instructive for children. And I have basically a storyteller, so I found stories within my family's life or my dad's life that I feel do relate to character and character strength, while I'm also talking about American history and African American history. So it's been a labor of love. I absolutely love meeting the kids that have written the essays. And we get stories. We had one boy a couple of years ago who stutters really kind of severely, and he wrote about his stuttering coming from trauma. He witnessed his father shoot his mother and then commit suicide. And it was they came out of New Orleans, and it was post-Katrina, when the family was floating around without the money or resources, and they just reached a boiling point, and the father cracked and did something horrible. But the boy was 4 years old, and he's been stuttering since then, and just starting to get help actually for the psychological part of it. But he was our grand prize winner, and he went to the All-Star game, and met him at his school, and it was just an incredible experience. And we sent him off. The commissioner sent him to a camp for kids that stutter. So we've had stories like that, in addition to children that have some kind of eating disorder or bullying or whatever the stories may be. But they all sort of, what we see in them is a resilience and an ability to move beyond their obstacle or barrier.
Colin was kind enough to give us some of your books that I've been reading the last few weeks. Find them very enjoyable, very entertaining. Tell us about what you try to impart to your student readers when you write your books, because one thing that's noticeable is that you write for children, but it seems like you write for different age levels within your books. Tell us about how you sit down and determine what you want to write about and for what age group.
Well, I started off, my first children's book was actually Jackie's Dine, and it was all adult writing, and it was an anthology. And it was the same 9 values that I use in the Breaking Barriers program. So I knew that was going to be a book that would hit teenagers and adults and middle school kids. I mean, it was definitely not for elementary school kids, not definitely, but it was not geared towards elementary school kids. And then I sort of I'd found my target audience through the Breaking Barriers program, and also in my writing, which was, I try to work with kids that are in big transitional times. So going from middle school into high school. And I just feel like that's such a critical time for kids. And so I wanted to really focus on character with them, because they're going to need a strong character to not get pulled into some of the negative things that can be out there in their high school years and some of the pressures that they're going to be under. And I wanted them to see that no matter what the obstacle was, they had this internal strength that they would be able to pull on again. And as things got more complicated in their lives, they would be able to pull back in that strength and know they had done it before, and they'll be able to do it again. And that's sort of what I look for in my characters, even if it's a novel that I've created, is this: how do you develop this inner strength? I had a series of contemporary novels for kids. One based out of Harlem, New York, and this boy has lost his father and is now also having to adjust to moving into Harlem after living in the suburbs. And even that kind of thing. How do we move our kids around and we expose them to different circumstances, and how do kids thrive in those kind of conditions and not under those conditions? So that's kind of what I try to do with my book. And I do try to consciously do it on multiple levels. Where I knew the Testing the Ice story would be good for a second grader. I don't write for preschool. Even as much as I love preschool, I like to tell a full story and be able to get into this whole character piece. And so I usually start with second grade.
Your parents certainly well known for their character. And tell us how they imparted that to you so that you can now write about them and what you want to reach for your student readers.
Well, my parents imparted to me by how they lived. So we didn't talk about values specifically, but there was constantly examples of courage and integrity and persistence and determination, and how they worked together in their partnership, and how they brought the family into a larger movement, the civil rights movement. So I saw this in our life, and to me, so it made it real. And so that's kind of why I try to make it real for kids.
In one of your books, there is a chapter called Why My Father. You talk about your father being the first African-American to play in major leagues. Tell us about that and why your father was chosen for that role.
Well, I think he was chosen for a number of reasons. One, he was the best all-around athlete on the West Coast when he's coming out of college. So he had a reputation that preceded him of being a strong athlete. Baseball was not his best sport. He didn't really learn skills, real baseball skills, until he spent a season with the Kansas City Monarchs. and was where he learned things like base stealing and those kind of skills. But he had the athletic ability underneath. That was the foundation. I think he was also chosen because he had demonstrated a commitment to equality and fighting for it in his service with the Army in Fort Hood, Texas, when he was accused of insubordination because, one, he refused to move to the back of the bus, a Jim Crow bus in Fort Hood. But again, knowing his rights, he asserted his rights, and he was correct, and therefore he ends up winning the case. But he stood up for himself, and this is before Rosa Parks. This is, really, again, groundbreaking stuff. He was also had strong character in that Branch Rickey related to in that he was a man of faith and did not party, didn't drink alcohol. And Branch Rickey felt all that was going to be important because, yes, he had a great partnership with my mother, but he also needed to have this ability to be positive on the field as well as off the field. Mm-hmm. And he was going to ask him to buy into faith when he agreed not to strike back with fists or words in the early 2 years. Mm-hmm. So by him producing Life of Christ from Papini, or if he had produced the Bible and read those same passages, he knew that my dad, being a man of Christ for faith, would understand it and latch onto it and be able to make it happen because it was for the larger good. So he could and that to me is just a testament to his strength of character, as opposed to some people see it as they'll say, "Oh, I couldn't do that." Well, until your character is tested, you don't know what you can do, mm-hmm. And so it's a real strength of character as opposed to a weakness.
I've read some baseball history. And in the 10 or 15 years preceding your father coming to the Dodgers, mm-hmm. there was talk on occasion about integrating baseball. Some owners toyed with it, backed off, didn't get a good response, so they said, well, we'll put it on the back burner. It seemed like the people who did think about it before your father came along, their philosophy was, let's find the best African-American player we can find and throw him out there. And the off-the-field stuff, the other things your father had to endure, they either didn't know about, didn't pay attention to it, didn't care about it. Tell us about the plan that Branch Rickey had, the way he laid things out for your father and made him understand the obstacles he'd face, and how that helped your father succeed in this situation.
Well, it's all about timing. So in the late 1900s, we had 2 African Americans who played in major leagues. And then it got shut down as we moved into the 20th century. So there were African Americans in the league prior to my dad. The shutdown was not just in baseball, it was across the board. We also had blacks who had moved into all aspects of leadership, and whether it's politics or business. And so all of that became threatening, and they shut it down as much as they could across the board with changing voter rules and kind of forcing a schism in our community so that they didn't have the strength that they had prior to that. So Branch Rickey, again, timing. So we're coming out of World War II, and baseball has lost a number of veteran players to the war. Either they're coming back injured, or they're too old at that point, or didn't come back at all. So they had to start looking at other sources of people, of players. And Branch Rickey, who is both a very smart businessman and an ethical man and a religious man and a visionary. He brought us the Farm League. Mm-hmm. He recruited teenagers when his veteran players went off to war, thinking, I'll get them in now, and even if they do go to war, they'll come back and they'll still be young. So he was already a man who thought that way. He was also a man in his late 60s who had a successful career within baseball, and he was willing to take the risk. So willing to take the risk and take the leadership here in spite of other owners who were not ready to move in that direction. And he got his board behind him, and that's what he needed to move forward. And he plotted and planned in every inch of how this was going to happen, and including looking for someone that, like I said, was a strong athlete, but maybe not the best baseball player at the time, but young enough to and strong enough to go in there and be able to commit to breaking the color barrier and playing solid, great baseball, and be able to focus on it in spite of a great deal of pressure.
Did you ever happen to meet Mr. Rickey?
I did. He came to the Hall of Fame when my dad was elected in 1962. I didn't see him much after, I was too young to remember him from the baseball years, and then after he moved out of the New York area. So I knew that he and my dad corresponded. So it's probably just more ceremonial times that I met him.
I don't think we understand today the impact that your father had in the African American community in this country. Can you talk about that and what he meant to African American people, when he first came to major leagues?
Well, there had been individual achievements, whether it's Joe Louis and the Max Smelling fight, which was inspirational to the black community as well as to America, because it was coming again. It was Germany against America, so they sort of overlooked the white against black. It was really about country at that point. But to the black community, here baseball was symbolic of America, symbolic of democracy, and yet they had been maintained segregation for 50 years. So to be able to break that down in an American institution with all that implied was very significant to all of us, to the black community, and I think also to the white community, because there were many that supported it. I mean, the sports writers were huge in that breakdown of segregation in baseball, as were ministers. So they had all put their efforts into it and realized that it had to start with baseball. It didn't have to start with football or basketball. They weren't under the same pressure because they didn't represent what baseball did to America. So that was a significant change for all those who were for equality.
You mentioned in one of your books that you hear a lot of stories from people who you visit with when you're on the road about your father. What is the reaction people have about your father today when they talk to you about him?
Well, it's all been all my life, because I really, people's stories are what gave me a picture of my dad playing baseball before I really had a full understanding of it. Whether it was when I would go with my dad to chock-full nuts and the ladies behind the counter would ply me with stories of family memories of going to baseball games and what an inspirational player my father was, and how it was always the family, or they were listening on the radio as a family to games. Again, his form of play and the fact that he was doing it against these great odds just, was so inspirational. So they've always been in the back of my mind. Today, as that generation moves on, you have less people who were actually present during those days, but they are still very inspired by the story. Even if it's kids who have read books on him or done papers on him, a lot of kids choose him for National History Day and study him from not the baseball perspective, but from a man of change perspective and a man who fought adversity. So they write me and ask questions so that they can have a first or second person influence in their paper, and because it's important to their writing as someone who was actually in some way part of that story. So It's a combination. It's the older people that knew and lived in Brooklyn, and the people that lived. Somebody today was in Chicago, and his father used to take him to the Cubs games, so he actually saw my father play. So it's always someone who comes out with this story. Sometimes they actually cry because it's so much about their family experience and person they loved that took them there and gave them this association, as much as it is about Jackie Robinson. So it can be quite emotional at times.
Your parents also were heavily involved in the civil rights movement, and you had a chance to meet many people who were active in that movement in the 50s and 60s. Tell us about, as a young woman, socializing and being with so many wonderful people who helped affect so much change.
Well, for me, the earliest memory I have of that is the Little Rock Nine. And I was only 7 years old. But I was inspired because they were children going to integrate a school, and my brothers and I were integrating our schools. And part of what is inspirational to me was that they were doing it as a group, and it was part of a movement. Where we were just like single individuals going into school, and there was nobody stopping us from going in there. And the trauma we faced once we got there was different in that it was more subtle forms of racism, and so we didn't even understand all the impact it was having on our self-esteem until much later on in our life. But it started with Little Rock Nine, and for me it was so cool because we were having dinner and they called my dad. And he came back to the table and he was like, you won't believe it. I mean, he was like so knocked out that they were calling him for inspiration, and he was so admiring of what they were doing. So that was my earliest memory. And then it became the Birmingham and the Children's March. And, I didn't even understand it all, but I wanted to go to Birmingham and be a part of this experience and to meet kids that were doing it. And I just thought we had some way of linking up. It was important to me. And then after the march on the Children's March, my dad found a way to link us via the jazz concerts at our home and actually giving us, assignments so that we were part of the actual fundraising as children. So we literally had to clean our rooms. I mean, that was a big deal, getting your rooms ready so the artists could change in your room, and getting up on time and getting up early and getting out there and then setting up our booth. And our booth was to sell hot dogs and soda. So you had to get people to come buy your hot dogs and soda and tally up your money, get the kids organized, the kids that were doing it. And it really felt like we were making a contribution to the civil rights movement and to children that had marched in Birmingham. So, and then after that, in between our first concert in June of '63 and our second concert right after the March on Washington, we as a family went to the March on Washington. And to me, that was just tops, because we'd been asking to go to Birmingham or to go marching. And now my father and mother were going there as an entire family. My whole family went, and to be in such a massive movement of people was overwhelming and very satisfying at the same time. So, and then I don't think you really understood. You understood that you've just heard when Dr. King speaks. You've heard a speech, a big speech. But you don't know how big it is. I mean, all that kind of plays out over the years, that how momentous that was.
Before I let you go, Sharon, just some final thoughts about what you would like to have these students feel about your father after you speak with them.
I'd like them to feel that his story can inspire them to overcome their own obstacles in life, and develop the ability to stay focused in a crisis or periods of insecurity, be able to or indecision or whatever, be able to pull from deep inside of them So understand what character means and how that plays with their life. So I think that's important for them to understand. And I try to bring that into my discussions. I also talk a lot about writing. Why, I explain to them, I do my own editing before I send my manuscripts to my editor, but my editor then sends back criticism and comments, and being able to think of your English teacher as your editor. And the only way we get stronger in writing is if, by someone else reading our material and giving us feedback. And how important that is, to develop that you both have the same end goal. You want the best product possible. So whether it's writing an essay or writing a book, you have, and they are another voice and an expert in the area. And I say, and I tell them, unless they try to sort of break down the integrity of the material. I said, it is still your book or your essay. So I don't let any editor tell me, I can't write that, or that's not appropriate, or change my words. It has to be a collaborative experience. And I give them examples of how I've had some editors that are really good at listening to you and believing in you, and some that try to control the direction of something, and so not all criticism is valid, or especially when they try to change what you believe or what your words are.
Sharon Robinson, the daughter of baseball great Jackie Robinson, who visited Central Wisconsin in March of 2018. This is Gene DeLisio reporting for WDLB and WOSQ.